Hi there, it's Mark and welcome to episode 5 of Mastering Masks in Adobe Lightroom. We started a few weeks ago with the very basics, and last week we managed to get up to Intersection, which is the single most powerful tool in masking in Adobe Lightroom. With it we can virtually mask anything. If you haven't watched last week's, I would encourage you to go back and have a look at that. Actually, I'd encourage you to go back as far as is required. You should easily be able to identify what skill level you're up to by looking at the introductions and just jump in where you feel like you want to jump in. If you want to jump in right now, welcome to the party. Today, a little bit of a recap. We've got an unfinished edit from last week which is left hanging as a challenge. We've got to learn something about brushes because, spoiler alert, you will need them for one of the challenges, and that should bring our knowledge base up to a level where all of these challenges are achievable. I'm just going to show you two of the challenges right now. Then I'm going to go and fill my coffee, play the titles, and we'll get cracking. All of the images we use today, the original for you to edit, a version of that original with some notes scribbled on to remind you offline of what the challenge was, and my version, my interpretation of the challenge for reference. They're all in a zip file, they're all on my website, and the link to that zip file is down below in the credits. This is to whet your appetite. We will start our challenges easy with something like this. I want you to change the guy's shirt colour, and some of the panels on the wall I want darkened. There's my interpretation of that, and I'll tell you which panels as well. And then towards the other end, but not the very end of the spectrum of challenges, we take this cityscape, and I want to make it dusk. I want a bit of a city glow behind, and I want to put some lights on. So that was my interpretation of that. And this is in Lightroom, not Photoshop. You would have needed Photoshop on steroids to do something like this easily at one point, or spent an age in Lightroom. Once you're up to speed with Lightroom basic panels and masking, this sort of edit from that to that takes 2 or 3 minutes. It really does. So that's it. Yeah, 2 of the challenges. I'm now going to roll the titles and get a coffee. I shall see you in about 7 seconds. Let's very quickly address the hangover from last week before we get into the crux of today. This was the picture. I wanted the top right with more definition. I wanted the left hand side with more shadow, and I wanted the doorway standing out. That's my interpretation of that. How did I approach that? Well, there were 3 masks. First and foremost, we have this one, which was the architecture. You can see the architecture there. I'll switch off the intersect. Architecture, and we intersected that with a luminosity range chosen from high up on the building. That was the resulting mask, from which I lowered the blacks and I increased clarity. Next, the archway. You can see the mask there. I will just switch off the luminosity range. It was a straightforward radial gradient, intersected with luminosity, which I picked from down the side of the stairs, and within that I increased the exposure and the shadows, and importantly the yellow tint to bring out the colour. So not only are we drawing your eye in with a bit of brightness, we're drawing your eye in with a bit more saturation of the colours inherent in the picture. Finally, the left hand side, if I switch that off, was a simple linear gradient dragged in from the left and intersected with a luminosity range which I chose from down here in the deep shadows. And once we had that mask, it was a case of lowering the exposure, lowering the shadows, and job was done. How did you get on with that? Let's move on, shall we? And let's meet Anna. So this is Anna. She's a friend of mine. She's a model. She's creative. She's funny, and she's currently pointing a gun at us. Anna has helped me out many times on photo shoots. For now, however, this picture gives us lots of blank canvas space. I want to demonstrate some traits of the brush tool, and also to answer a question I was given about why so many masks. Why so many masks in general is because these are all global. So if I adjust exposure, every single pixel is subject to that exposure. It is a global change. What if I targeted something like a color? Okay, let's come down to color mixer and target these reds and put the saturation down or up or down. Every single red pixel on this picture is subject to that change. So even though it's red, so you can kind of think it's confined here, it's a global change. And there's plenty of time we want to target something, and that's where masks come in. Now, Adobe tends to call these local adjustments, but I prefer to call them targeted adjustments, because that's exactly what we are doing. We are using component parts of landscape, or picking an object, or we're using a brush, or gradients, or a people selection and parts of people, a color range, whatever it is, we are using it to narrow down a selection and confine something, to target something within which we will then make some edit changes. Let's click on the brush and learn some things about the brush tool you might not have known. So what we want is to preload our brush with lots of negative exposure just so we can see it, and we can start brushing. So okay, let's brush in here because we want to take the reflection out of the glasses. Now ordinarily I might have just put a little mask on there, but guess what, you can do this sort of thing freehand. So there you go, that is the brush tool in operation. But did you know you can do straight lines with it? If you click and hold and then press your shift key and move your mouse either side, left or right, it will go in a straight line until you stop. You can even start bringing your mouse up or down. As long as you've got that shift key held, it remains a straight line. You can also go vertical. So let's just click up here, hold my shift key, and if my first movement is down or up, as long as I keep my shift key on now, I can go to side, it doesn't matter, and I will get a vertical line. Let's get rid of those. Drawing straight lines doesn't have to be vertical or horizontal. What if we wanted to put something along the edge of this wing here? So let's make our brush a little bit bigger, bit more of a feather. If I click once, I'm not holding my shift key now, and I move to somewhere else, let's say here, hold my shift key now and click, I get a straight line. And what if we were going to use that to just take some of the shine off the front leading edge of that wing? Then we can do that. So we can do straight lines. Let's pile the negative exposure back in. So click, move, shift, click, move, shift, click, move, shift, click, move, shift, click. It will go between the clicks. Why is that good? That's good for editing railings, editing street scenes, editing anything which is straight. But it's also useful for light rays. Light rays, I'll just delete this one. Light rays that may be coming from a street light, or hint hint, a searchlight. How does that work? Searchlights kind of get wider, headlights kind of get wider, their beams get wider. Well, that's another feature of the brush. You can change the size of the brush between clicks. So let's start off small and let's click here. Now I said that if I move and shift click, it will draw a straight line. But before I shift click, what if I make the size much bigger? Shift click. I now get a cone of light, a cone brush stroke. Okay, Anna's in the way, so let's just subtract subject. And there we now have this light beam coming up behind her. Let's put some exposure in there. And let's put some dehaze in there. And now we've kind of got the effect of a light, a torch, shining out over to here. That is a very useful feature for adding sunbursts coming through some foliage, for adding and enhancing street lights, headlights and things in nighttime type photographs. So remember that technique, because we shall come back to it and need it later on. The only other thing I would say is, did you know there's more than one brush? Let's create another brush. You've got A and B. Usually it's on A and everyone leaves it on A. What's the point of B? B is no different in the sliders, but you can preload it with something different. So let's say, for example, I was doing a lot of these beams. I might decide that my end size is that and my start size is that. I could, and this won't look good on this picture, but for demonstration purposes, I'm on A. I will click once. I'll move to B, which is a bigger brush. Hold my shift key and click. And if I want another one that's identical to that for the other headlight on the car, I'd come back to A because it's the same size. Click once. B, move my brush over, hold my shift and click again. So now I've got two identical size start and end points should they be car headlights. Food for thought. Let's move on now to our first challenge picture. Number 1. Here's a guy. What I want you to do is to colour his shirt and colour a few of the tiles. In the downloads you will get this version as well, which says, look, it's that tile and that tile I want coloured and I want the shirt black. My visual take on that is this. Next challenge. And the accompanying notes say, here in the UK we don't use yellow on our zebra crossings, so please make it white. Fix it. There's my take. Just a little hint here. It's not just yellow that's changing because there's yellow up here and yellow here. So think about that. Next challenge. This one is courtesy of my OCD. What does it say in the notes? The example. Look at the shadow of the building on the coloured blinds versus the blue. The blue are all a different depth of shadow. That doesn't sit right with me, so I want the fixed, and that's my take on the fix. If you notice here, it's now correct and correct. Next one, and I want us to put a glow in here and some spotlights. Well, what are we going to do with the spotlights? There's my take on that. Almost finally, what I want to do here is I want to make day into dusk, add a city glow and put some lights on, and there was my take on the result. Now, just to help you a little bit with this, on my basics panel you can see how I've just dropped the exposure and I've brought the temperature over, taking blacks down. That is the fundamental initial part of making this more of a dusk scene. The rest is masks. And finally, what is the goal on this one? Well, my instructions say I want to repaint the car. Now, if you draw a line down through the colour change in this building, I want this side of the car to be this green and I want this side of the car to be that pink. My take on that is that. And a further hint is to be mindful when you're doing selections, when you're doing your masks, that you can see through the windows. All right, they are the tasks. I'm going to press pause now, go and get myself a cup of coffee. You have a go of these, and when we come back for the second half of this video, I will start going through exactly what I did in order to achieve those. See you very shortly. We're going to step through each in turn. The first three at a little bit more of a pace than the second three. The second three have got more moving parts, therefore I feel I need to take more time, and also some new concepts in there, such as the strongly hinted at search beams. So T for our toolbar, which we talked about in a previous episode, such that when I'm on my masks I've got access to the pin view. Normally this is on auto for me, but I've chose selected so that every time I choose a mask, the only pins you see on screen are for that mask, and it just helps understand what we're doing. Notice there are no global edits in this picture. So back to masks. 2 masks, there was 2 tasks. Let's start with the top one. This was the panels. Now, there were no intersects here. It was object selection. So that one, and we just drew around it with our object selection tool, and it was very precise. Then we came over to this one with an add. And then we came over to this one by clicking on add and chose object selection again. And this one decided to run into the skirting board. No worries. We then had a subtraction with the brush, and the brush was a straight line as previously demonstrated. So that was it. Once the mask was defined, I targeted what I want. I then just brought the exposure down. Next we have our dancing dad. The initial selection is person and then chose clothes, and then an intersect with the colour to pick his top out. However, it still had a bit of the pants in. So the third one was a subtraction using an object selection, and I drew around his pants, as you can see. That was the object selection. Now, interestingly enough, in the actual edit, because I wanted to colour it black, I brought the exposure down, but also saturation. Had I not brought saturation down, there would still be elements of some of that blue, darker blues in his shirt. If you want to make something black, colorizing, take the saturation out before you adjust the exposure. Other than that, relatively simple task. Next one, no global edits, only targeted. 1 mask, a few parts. First, I chose a colour range. So we use a colour range, which was yellow. And notice it hits the taxi door and it hits above the top of the doorway. The next one was a subtraction using a linear gradient, which you can see coming down from the top, which coincidentally hit with a curb, so protected the taxi and protected the signage above the door. And the third was a brush, which is a very small subtraction because there's little reflections of the yellow in the front of the bus, on the curb and just under the taxi. You could argue that one wasn't necessary, but I added it anyway. Once I'd got the mask, I just took the saturation out, so all that yellow disappeared, and then I bumped up the exposure to make it more bright. Again, relatively simple. Third picture. We did this in 3 parts. The first part was to choose a linear gradient, which came down from the top as such, and it was chosen to line up with the shadow on the blue, which was the lower of the shadows. I then intersected that with a colour range so that it picked out only the yellow inside the linear gradient. And once I had that on the mask, I then took the exposure down till I felt the shadow matched the shadow colour in the blue. Then we came down the screen to do the same again. But this time, we did our linear gradient. We intersected with the colour. But notice the top row. Because this linear gradient comes all the way down from the top, it goes over our previous mask. So I then had to fix the top bit, so I did a subtraction with a linear gradient. The result being that. And again, we used exposure to darken. Now that we've realised we need to do that for this principle, because our linear gradient is going to come down again, the third mask is a repeat of the second one. Linear gradient down from the top, colour range to match, subtract a linear gradient from the previous 2 layers while I'm on the mask, down with the exposure. Again, relatively simple. The thing to note, and the thing we've been talking about ongoing, is to think what tools do what. What is the easiest way to select something? What would then need to come out? What would then need to add? Do I need to combine something like a colour and a luminosity? Start to think in terms of what the masks are, both standalone and joined or intersected, and you're most of the way there. The rest is just trying them out. And that's what these videos are all about. And so to our picture of Elizabeth Tower with Big Ben hiding somewhere behind the clock face there, and the city glow we wanted to add, which also incidentally highlights the noise in this picture, but it's not my picture, it's a stock picture. Accreditation for this particular picture is in the zip file, and noise is not a concern at this moment in time. However, the glow first. So what we should do is simply add a radial gradient, and we'll draw the gradient in somewhere around here, and we can either intersect it with the sky or subtract the architecture. Let's do an intersect. So hold down the Option key on a Mac, Alt key on a PC, click intersect and choose sky. Having got that, the adjustment we want to make is to increase the exposure, possibly a little bit of yellow in there too, a little bit of dehaze perhaps. Yes, we can start to see more noise, but this isn't my picture, it's one of the stock pictures we've got, accreditation for which, by the way, is also in the zip file, and noise is for another day. Let's add those search beams so we know we want a brush. We've seen the technique, so let's choose A to be a small brush, and we want quite a bit of feather on that. B, possibly a little bit bigger, but we want a feather on that as well. It's a bit bigger as the beam dissipates into the fog of the night. And we shall click once somewhere down in the building here, choose B, relocate our brush, hold down our Shift key and click. Go back to A, click down here in the building somewhere, go to B, let's bring this one up to here, Shift click, go back to A, click somewhere down here, go back to B, and let's fan it out to about there, hold down our Shift key and click, and there you have it. What do we need to do now is to remove the architecture. So subtract landscape, which will give us the component parts, one of which is architecture, and click create mask, and now we've got the beams going in the right place. Let's edit them before we do the next bit. So we want to add a bit of exposure, a bit of dehaze, possibly to taste, either a bit of blue or a bit of yellow. I'm going to go with a bit of yellow. Now we still need to fix this because that's unnatural. A beam, a torch, if you shine it at night, anything in fog, will not only dissipate, but it will also fade to nothing. So we want to make sure these don't just stop. Now if they were hitting the underside of a cloud, yes, you would see that, but they're not. So we need to fade these off, put a graduated fade on these. So the clue is in what we want to do. So let us subtract with a gradient, a linear gradient. Start up here, and we don't want a narrow one, we want one with quite a big sweep on it, and then we'll just position it so it looks a bit more natural. And there you have our searchlights. Now that's not bad, considering that particular effect wasn't even using Intersect, which is one of the more advanced tools for honing masks. This was just a brush and monopolizing on the features of the brush that we learned today and subtracting a couple of things. Let's move on to our next picture. Our first place to start is with the original picture and we'll do a bit of a general edit. So in the general edit department, I just want to lower the exposure somewhat to darken it off. I'm going to use the blue tint to make it a little bit more like you would expect at night. I'm going to take some of the highlights out. I'm going to drop the blacks so they're a bit more black, and possibly a little bit of vibrance in there. And that kind of works for me as the starting point. The first ever challenge where we've put some global edits in. And now on to masks. So overall, I want to darken this picture. Oh, that's a dust spot. 1 second. Just get rid of that dust spot. And back to masks. Okay, the overall thing is to darken the sky. And I want to do that as a graduated darkness. So we will choose a linear gradient and we'll pull that linear gradient in, but leave it so we've still got a bit of a horizon glow in general, and then we will darken that sky quite a bit, actually, probably about 2 stops under, something like that. Next we want the city glow, so let's create a new mask which is a radial gradient. We've done it a few times now. Put the radial gradient in, and our options here are to either subtract the architecture or intersect with the sky. So I can't remember which was the last one we did. I'm just going to subtract the architecture. Subtract landscape, and within that there should be an architecture option. There it is. Click on create mask, and there's the glow. So let's just make it glow. Put a bit of yellow in there. There we have it. And finally, we want to do something to put some lights on. Now, I'm not going to do all the lights I did in the previous one. I'm just going to demonstrate this technique, and we'll probably concentrate on these 2 tower blocks here. So let's start addressing the lights with a luminosity range. So we'll choose something quite dark, such as there, and we refine it, possibly make it a little bit more condensed here. And do we want to bring the feather in or not? I think the feather's quite fine. We're going to intersect this with a brush, so let's just hold down the Alt or Option key, choose intersect with a brush, and let's paint on a window. Now as soon as I start painting, all the mask goes away. Why is that? That is because the mask is only showing where there is an intersect, and we've started that process. So all that luminosity range is only visible where the intersect is, which is currently these windows. But you can see now how I'm moving the brush around. I don't have to define the window. It's doing it, and it's even showing the window frames as being separate. Now let's concentrate on what the edit's going to be now, shall we? So we want to bump it up somewhat, a couple of stops to get a bit of lightness in there. From an exposure point of view, let's throw loads of highlights in as well. We really want these to pop in a minute. Possibly bump the whites all the way up as well. And let's take some of the saturation out so that those other brightnesses show through. Remember earlier we said if you want to make something black, take the saturation out before you add negative exposure. If you want to make something a bit whiter, take the saturation out before you then add exposure. And now we've got windows, and the beauty is we've got windows wherever we want to paint them. So now I can just keep going and painting windows in and do a whole row. As long as I had my luminosity mask defined properly, we can start and paint windows. How long would that take without this technique? How precise would you have to be? And here I'm now being just a little bit slapdash, if I'm being honest. Putting these windows in, and it works like that. Possibly a bit more yellow in, and away we go, painting in windows. I'm going to stop there. I'll let you finish that off, but it's as easy as that. Now I took my time to explain this, but even so it's only been a couple of minutes showing this, and yet this is a really detailed edit, but next to nothing. once you know the simple techniques of using Intersect. I will leave that one there. I will let you finish that off, and let's do our last picture. So I left this one to last because I thought on face value people might think it was the most complicated, but it turns out not to be complicated. It's methodical, and it's there to exercise the part of this course which is about thinking what the individual things do and what's the best way to combine them to get the end result, keeping it simple all the way. So let's start with the original. Let's select an object using Adobe's object selection and a highly detailed selection. Yet Adobe finds the object quite well. Now, forget the two-tone for now. What is it we want to get rid of? We want to get rid of what we can see through the windows here. We don't want those masked. I want to see the pink through this window. I want to see the green through this window. So let us now subtract from this a color range and pick what we can see through the window. That's the front window. What about the back window? Well, let's subtract again a color range, and what do we see through the back window? And now we've got a good selection of the car, and we can see through the windows. Alright, let's change the color of the car. Let's do the color which matches this green. So let's try and change the hue to get a match to the green, which is probably about there, but it's a brighter hue. So without messing on too much with colors, what we're trying to do is just bring the darkness down a little bit. There, I'm going to call it as being correct. So now I need to delete the mask from this side. So let's subtract again with a linear gradient. There it is. Let's put a cross on the dividing line, click, hold a shift key down, and just move ever so slightly to the right. And now what we've done is we've confined that mask to that half. Are you ready to do it all again? Well, you don't have to. We can just copy this mask. So duplicate mask. Click on the linear gradient of the duplicate, and over this little dot, click and drag around so that we invert that final selection. Job done. But we need to now go back to the hue change and roll it the other way to get a match towards that salmon colour, which I think is probably around there, and take some saturation out. How long did that take? It was no time at all. It was simple, and yet face value that looks like a complicated edit to do. That is the power of masking. I know this video's been very long, but it's not a wham blam, thank you ma'am, show your technique and off you go. This is part of a course. We've got one more lesson to go, and that's next week. So stick around, and if you haven't already, please click on the subscribe button and click on that bell to be notified of future releases. I'll see you next Thursday, if not before, with some other stuff. Bye for now.